I can say a few words about how we went about determining, sort of each person's role as part of the process of creating this new edition. And to some degree, my expertise is in American cinema. So when David and I sat down and were looking at places to potentially update chapters, he more or less said, "Why don't you handle all of the chapters that deal with American cinema?" And so that was a useful starting point because it gave me a focus that really drew upon my, areas of expertise. And David, on the other hand, of course, was, extremely knowledgeable about Asian cinema. So there were kind of natural areas of research expertise where we could kind of rely um, on our backgrounds, the fact that we would be keeping up with certain parts of the global cinema picture a little bit more than others. And so we kind of went through chapter by chapter to kind of determine like where we thought changes would be needed. It's one of those things, of course, that as you're writing a history book, unless there's a kind of big new discovery of a director who, deserves to be better known, there isn't much that changes with the early chapters other than to sort of make some slight revisions. Because one of the things that goes on with our editor is that they will always say, well, we want to keep the page count the same. So that means if we plan on adding material to later chapters, we have to find places to just trim, in some cases ever so slightly, a sentence here, a sentence there, a sentence there, to make room for the new material. And so it meant that there weren't a lot of changes to be made to those early chapters, other than a little bit of compression in places. But we anticipated that there would be need for big changes, especially because of the pandemic in the later chapters. Knowing that this was going to be something that would be read for potentially years after the pandemic, we felt it was particularly important to address a lot of the impact that it had on movie going, on distribution, on all sorts of things that we felt needed to be accounted for. So a lot of the decision making had to do with basically from chapters 20 through 30. And there were particular chapters that, again, fit our kind of areas of expertise. I will say there were also chapters that David felt particularly proud of, like pride of ownership of having written the earlier drafts, and saying, I will talk about like the digital, which of course he had been studying for quite some time. Particularly his book, Pandora's Digital Box, was an important resource for him in being able to update all of those changes that have been made in terms of digital distribution and digital exhibition. So as a kind of overall, a lot of this was kind of figuring out, you do this chapter, I'll do this chapter.
There was a regular schedule set up by the publisher, and we would be notified when they wanted us to start revising. Originally, McGraw-Hill had a fairly long interval between editions, but there was a problem in this country in that there were companies that would buy up used textbooks and sell them on the market, obviously more cheaply and obviously with no royalties going back to the author, no money going back to the publisher. And they wanted to basically update fairly often so as to make the older editions somewhat obsolete and more difficult for these companies to sell. And so we were revising more often as time went by. We were up to the point where we were doing revisions every 3 years, which is rather difficult because we had two textbooks to revise. And so out of any 3 years, we would have only 1 year when we weren't working on the revisions. And of course, we were doing our projects on other books. Obviously, David and I were writing other books at the same time, and Jeff was working on other books. So it became rather difficult. And more recently, there has been a switch to a new system of revising, which Jeff can tell you about, because this is a very recent innovation by the publishers.
Yes, McGraw-Hill has more or less determined the schedule of new editions, but also they've determined a schedule for what they're calling new releases. And what the new releases means essentially is that they want more frequent updates, but those frequent updates will be made to the ebook rather than the print edition. So they want to kind of annualize this process. They're calling these editions, and it's not clear that they apply to every book that's in the the McGraw-Hill catalog, but they have identified a certain number of titles that they want to brand as, quote, evergreens. And as evergreens, the idea is that they get regular yearly updates, but that those updates will be made strictly to the ebook edition until you achieve enough kind of critical mass that the accumulated number of changes now have made it fundamentally a different textbook. And at that point, they've suggested that they would go to a print edition. And so I have no idea at this point when they will determine that, or how they will determine, that, okay, it's now time for a 6th edition because we've looked at all of the changes that have been made in the last 3 years and everything's there in the ebook. So we'll just go to print, something like that. I'm not sure that that's an ideal situation for a number of reasons. I mean, one of the things that's a big appealing part of the program is that we, of course, have great illustrations. And, at this point, at least with the very first process of updating the book, which I did in May and June, it's not like I was adding a lot of new illustrations. And that's something which it costs the publisher money. In an ebook, it doesn't really matter, but it just seemed as though in terms of thinking long-term about the fact that this would at some point go to a print edition, you start to worry about, well, what will this do to our page count if we suddenly add like 10 illustrations? So I think at this point, I've proposed one. It's a Barbenheimer meme, and I'm not sure they'll even say yes for kind of copyright reasons, at which point there will be no new illustrations for this, this 2025 release. But presumably there'll be a 2026 one, at which point I'll have opportunities to again make further updates and add new illustrations. But at least in this initial incarnation, because everybody's kind of new to this process, they also said we want to keep this a fairly light revision. So no whole new sections, no, the overall kind of organization and architecture of the book in terms of not just chapters, but headings and subheadings within the book. They wanted to keep that all the same. So the new updates really involve kind of, highlighting works by some of the directors who are discussed. So like a sentence or two on Poor Things, or I added a paragraph on Memoria, the Where is Seth the Cool film. So it's kind of a process, and it's something that I think we're getting used to, at least in my case, as the first time through. But this seems to be what the wave of the future will be, is that maybe in 4 years there's a new edition, but maybe not. We don't know.
Yeah, one thing that's different now under this evergreen system is the fact that the publisher no longer requires us to have as they described it, 3 major changes in the book. We always had to come up with something that the salespeople who were, across the country showing the book to teachers could point to in the book and say, here's a major new change. And so we would have to come up with 3 things, even though we didn't necessarily think there were 3 things that were that important that needed to be added. But we had to pass these changes through their system, and they would decide, okay, these are good enough, these are major enough changes that you can do this. So it had to be every time 3 changes, and now that's gone. The changes that are made can be fairly minor. They can be scattered through the book, and yet not something that the salespeople are going to point out, because they're maybe, as Jeff says, a new sentence about 4 things. So that has been, I think, something that makes it easier for the author, which is not something the publisher is usually concerned with, but it has turned out that way. And I think it makes it easier for us to decide, what kinds of changes we want to make.
I should add something about the process, because I think you had, asked a little bit about the kinds of things that we would try and determine, would be worth adding to a new edition. And it was something that David had taught me several years ago about, like, the process of doing these kinds of updates. Is that I'm, a regular subscriber to Variety, look at lots of different, things that pop up in my email online. And he had always said, create a folder on your computer that whenever you come across something that looks interesting and could be potentially useful for the next edition, make a PDF of it, save it. And then when it comes time to do the revisions, I would open up this folder and there would be 30, 40 things that I could go through and say, oh yeah, this is something that we want to add. Sometimes David would forward things to me, or I would forward something to him, or Kristin would forward something. So we were always kind of actively accumulating little stories from the trade press and from, other kinds of outlets, or things that would be turn up in new books that are published as things that could potentially be fodder for some of the changes that we would make to the next edition. And that was true for both film art and film history.
I would like to ask you to go a little back in time to the first edition, which, if I'm correct, appeared in 1994, so in the first part of the 90s. Kristin Thompson and David Bordwell were already, of course, established not only professors, but also film writers, film scholars. You already published together Film Art, an Introduction, that was, I think, is the book of yours that got to the 30th edition. I think it's the most re-edited one, re-released book of yours, and also a film on Hollywood cinema, film style and mode of production to 1960. So I have many curiosities, but one of them is, how come you decided to write this book on film history after so many other books you wrote independently or together, or from other perspectives, or on more focused, let's say, topics? It was something that had to do also with teaching, with the need of updating, I don't know, the kind of books that were available on general film history, or not necessarily?
Yes, that what you just said is quite true. There really was no basic film history textbook in the 70s and 80s that really was comprehensive. It was a period when film history was just burgeoning. I mean, in the 70s, especially the late 70s and the 80s, archivists were much more willing to show older films to scholars who could come in and watch them on editing machines. There were conferences like the 1978 Brighton Conference, which revealed the early silent cinema to the world. I mean, we had thought of it as Griffith and Méliès and Lumière, and suddenly there were all these short films, these amazing Pathé films and Gaumont films, and other events. The Pordenone Festival, La Giornata del Cinema Muto, was showing retrospectives of films that people had no idea existed. I remember the first time I went to Pordenone with David, they were showing a retrospective of Swedish films for up to 1920. And it was just a revelation. I mean, nobody had known about anything beyond maybe Sjöström's The Outlaw and His Wife and Serrarn's Treasure by Stiller. But this was dozens of films by major directors like Georg Klerker that we had never heard of. And they did that every year. They were doing it with Soviet cinema and German cinema before 1920. And it just became possible to understand more about the history of cinema, that it wasn't just the familiar classics that everybody showed, Bicycle Thieves and The Seventh Seal and so forth. There were all these other directors and films and film industries that had been working without being paid any attention to by film historians. So there was that. On a more practical level, I needed a job, basically. I actually was not teaching at the university. I did a couple of guest spots early on after I got my degree in 1977. But we basically wrote film art in order to give me a job and an income. And that worked fairly well in the long run, but in the short run, it took quite a while for film art to become a standard and to be used more. And it was partly because universities were adding more courses. There were relatively few programs in film when we started out in 1977, which is when we signed the contract to do film art. NYU, New York University, was giving a PhD program. The University of Wisconsin at Madison had one, University of Iowa, University of California in Los Angeles, but there really weren't that many courses. So we were presumably being used in, film art was being used in courses where there were courses, but gradually in the 70s and 80s, you got more and more classes. But film art was not doing terribly well in the 80s, and my income was pretty low. So in 1987, I suggested to David that maybe I should write another textbook, which would be Film History and Introduction. So his response to that was, well, if I wrote it with you, it would be done sooner, which was obviously true. So we agreed that we would do such a book. And at that point, we made up an outline of chapters that we thought would be create a comprehensive film history. And we basically, as I describe it, we divided up the world. We were writing separate chapters. We don't write together on the same chapters. So I wrote pretty much everything in what is your first volume of the book, up to the end of World War II. So 1945 was sort of the cutoff where Kristin stops and David begins. David did write some of the earlier material. He wrote the portions on Japanese and Indian studio systems in the 1930s because he was more expert in those. But apart from that, I wrote the rest of it, I think. And then he wrote the more modern section up to the present. And I wrote a few of the pieces in that later part of the book. I wrote the portion on animation. I wrote all the sections on the United Kingdom and basically the Commonwealth or ex-Commonwealth countries like Australia and New Zealand. But most of that is David. So, and we kind of divided up the world. I mean, I did Australia. I did America up to the end of the war. David obviously did Asia, and And we set out to just watch as many films as we possibly could. We went to archives to watch prints that weren't available in any other form. And of course, that was the era of VHS tape, but there were no DVDs at that point, so we weren't able to watch films or get frame enlargements the way you can now. So we came up with a proposal, and since we, by that point, film art was being published by McGraw-Hill, so we turned in a proposal to our editor there. And the idea was, they agreed to publish it, and the contract said that we should turn in 750 double-spaced pages, which was quite a lot. I mean, that for a book at that point, in film especially, that was a lot. And so we started working. And I have some letters that David and I wrote to each other in the autumn of 1988. And he said, I'm starting to get a little worried about the limitation on the length, because it was obvious that if we really were going to be comprehensive, we needed more space. And we just kept writing. We ignored the limits that they had put on us. And eventually, the book turned out to be exactly twice as long as that. It was 1,500 pages that we turned in. And to our editor's credit, he said, okay, we'll publish it this way. We're not going to make you cut it, which was great. I'm not sure they would do that today, but this was back in 1988, and we signed the contract on November 30th, 1988. And so we kept working, and eventually, I think it was actually published in 1992, because McGraw-Hill had a habit of putting the copyright date ahead for some reason. So it's rather confusing, but I know that was published in 92. So that's how the book came about, just in terms of the practicality of our lives. It was the idea that I would have a greater income. And actually, right at about that time, film art was becoming much more successful. And we were making considerably more in the way of royalties on film art than we made on film history. And this has always been the case. In the United States, there are many more introductory film courses taught than film history courses. And the two textbooks are, not doing equally well at all. They never have, but enough people have used film history that it stays in print and continues to be revised. So that was the origin of film history.
One of the things that I can add is from the perspective of one of David's grad students at the time. It's, I think, something that David was very good at was figuring out ways in which his pedagogy as an instructor and his research for something like this kind of project could kind of feed one another. So I remember as a grad student in 1988, David had set up a 2-course sequence of the history of post-war European cinema, going up to 1968 for the first class, and then after 1968 for the second class. And he showed 2 films a week and did lectures on all of the kind of major movements and directors. And, I didn't know this at the time, but in retrospect, especially based on Kristin's indication that David was really focusing on the material after World War II, it was clear that he was working out what those chapters would be for the textbook as something that he was using his teaching to be able to help prepare him to do. So, and he did the same when I was his TA a couple of years later in a course on film styles and genres, where he was very open with me. He said, well, I'm working on the textbook right now, and, I need to write the sections on kind of new Chinese cinema and African cinema. So we're going to be teaching those as kind of units in this class, and you'll be helping me out with this. So, and that was that was, I still remember him selecting 3 Chinese films, one from Taiwan, one from the mainland, and one from Hong Kong. And the films he showed were Ho Xiaoxian's Dust in the Wind, John Woo's The Killer, and Chen Kaigei's King of the Children. And that was something which fed quite directly into the writing of those sections of the textbook.
Yeah, and I could say that that was exactly how film art was done. David was teaching an introduction to film course when he first arrived at Wisconsin. Was still working on his dissertation, but he got the job there in 1973 and started immediately teaching this large lecture course, Introduction to Film. And the concepts that were used in the lectures went directly into that textbook. So yeah, it's actually quite a good way to write a book. I had a summer course that I taught at the University of Stockholm in 1999. For 1 month, I taught a course on Lubitsch's silent films, and each lecture I gave became a chapter of the books that I subsequently published on Lubitsch. So it's actually a good way of working.
Yes, and also it's very the films that you mention in the book, the filmmakers, the topics, because it's a book that also contextualizes in economics, it puts film in a much wider context than we were used to with a lot of film histories from before. And even if the remarks are brief or sometimes they are just a few words, still you have hints from many directions to understand the phenomenon, or I don't know, particular stylistics, which is something very overwhelming in a way. It's something that it's you know, I was asking myself while coordinating the translation, how much research you had to do for each of these chapters in so many fields, in a way, on a particular period, on a particular place. But also, I was curious about the selection of films and filmmakers, because many times you seem to try not to include only the canon, you know, the most famous and most, they are also included, but you also include a lot of films that you seem to consider very important or very interesting, that were not, or still are not necessarily part of the canon. And also many times you include films that don't seem to be necessarily masterpieces, that seem to be more important because they are useful to understand, I don't know, the norm of a period or of a context and something. So it's also a very, very wide field of film representations. I don't know how to say, it's like a cinephile heaven in a way, to discover so many titles of films that you never heard of probably, or just a little bit. I was also curious from this perspective, did you decide together what to include in a chapter that each of you was focused on, or it was completely your decision or Mr. Bordwell's decision on his chapters, what films, filmmakers he would include, and how he would structure the chapter, or it was something that you already continuously discussed, and maybe you read his chapters and he read your chapters and you re-edited them after these discussions, or not necessarily this way?
Yeah, well, David and I certainly have read everything that the other one wrote for all of our books and articles and so forth, and offered suggestions, but we certainly did not plan together which films to include. I had been doing a lot of research intending to write a book on the 1920s, and especially what I call the commercial avant-gardes of the 20s, German Expressionism, French Impressionism, Soviet Montage, all of which were avant-garde movements, and yet they took place in industries that were trying to make a profit. So I had done a lot of archival work watching films from those movements. And I did find some fairly obscure ones that are not part of the canon, as you say, but that seemed to me to be important. So I included them. And I think we did that. If we thought something was a good example of the style of the period, even if it wasn't a well-known film, we would put it in. And also, we made an attempt, which I think we don't get much credit for, to include a lot of women's films, a lot of films from minority filmmakers. We had African films that certainly had never been heard of, South American films, but we really tried to have a diversity, as we call it now, in the book. And that's true from the beginning. If you look back, we do have lots of filmmakers who weren't, the mainstream and were not included in other textbooks or histories. But as to the economic part of it, I think we really discovered during our work on the classical Hollywood cinema how important that was. We went into writing that book in the late 70s, right about the time film art came out. And we thought we were going to write a very short book on classical Hollywood cinema, and there was probably very little to be found in the archives that would help us. And as we went along, we discovered there's lots of stuff in archives. There's a huge amount of material available on the industry that nobody had been exploiting up to that point. And the book, of course, turned out to be a very large book. It's I don't know if it's as long as film history, but it's a big book. And it went into a lot on the studio system and the technological developments, because we were interested in how those affected the way that filmmakers worked and the films, how it influenced how the films they put out looked and sounded. So we knew that that could be done. And I think we felt that that was important to do for other industries outside the United States. So we have a whole chapter on other film studio systems, as the UK, India, Japan, and so forth, which had major industries, which had been pretty much ignored up to that point. So yeah, we did consider that it was very important to look at that kind of context.
Also, an important particularity, not only of this book, also of other books of yours, but it's very important here. It's the selection of photos, of photograms from the films. They are always included. I mean, they are always included to explain some particularities of stylistics, especially. And they are very useful to when you read to understand immediately. I don't know, in a second, to understand what you mean by something that you address. This also seems like something, I don't know, very hard to do, especially when you, even now, when you have digital tools available, it's not easy. But it's very hard for me to imagine how you did it when you were working with, I don't know, with film, in the archives. Did you photo them? Did you write, I don't know, the exact seconds that you wanted, or how did you do it to be so precise in the decisions? Because they seem to be very precise, the decisions. They don't seem to be approximatively something. I mean, yes. The selection of them, yeah.
Yes, well, looking back on it, it's hard to imagine how we did manage to do it. But from very early on, when David was teaching his introductory film course, he would use slides made from film frames. Sometimes they were very bad slides because they would be photographed off the screen with a stop motion projector. But we also found film equipment, still film equipment that was basically designed to duplicate slides. I mean, people apparently wanted to duplicate their own slides, and there was a little frame holder at the end of a bellows, and we would photograph, instead of slides, film frames. So we put the strip of film into this little holder. There would be a light behind it, and we would photograph it. And it was, yes, it was very difficult because, of course, we were having to, we couldn't see the image when we photographed it. We had to wait till it was developed, and sometimes it didn't come out too well. But we started to make different, 3 or 4 images of the same frame to make sure we got a good image. And we did that. We went to companies that had storage facilities for 35mm films, and we were using rewinds to find the film clips we needed. But we also worked in archives, and I have to say the Belgian Cinematheque, the Royal Film Archive of Belgium, was incredibly helpful, and they have an amazing collection. I don't think it's well known, but they are one of the largest archives in the world, and they were very cooperative. So I sometimes say that probably half the images, the frames in film history and introduction came from their prints. They were amazing. The main problem early on with using frame enlargements, once we had them, is that publishers were very reluctant to use them. They were convinced somehow that this was a violation of copyright. And we basically had to convince publishers that no, this was fair use. And eventually it became obvious that this was true. And we were using these frames in our books, and we were not getting threatened by the studios with lawsuits. It was, I'm sure they didn't care. I mean, if they had any sense, they realized this was publicizing their films. But yeah, more and more we were able to use frame enlargements with no need to get permission from the studios. We just used as many as we wanted. And this is what eventually led up to the fact that we now have a lot of clips online because they realized that there is such a thing as fair use, at least in the United States, and you can quote things. It's the equivalent of quoting something in a literary discussion. So at this point, we have really no problems with that, but it was a struggle initially to be able to use those frames.
Something else that I admire very much in the book is the way you always try to connect the periods and the contexts. Like as we go further reading the book, you always make connections between the 70s in some place with something that happened in the 40s or something that happened in the 20s. Always, even when it's just a brief parenthesis and you just how do you say, you just indicate that you can read something in a previous chapter. It's like a multimedia mix in a way. The book, it's always referring to something from the past. So this is also something very important, I think, also in teaching. I think it's a very important tool for the young people today to understand how not to look at the past as something that is dead or that is it's something that is left behind, but to reactivate it as you do. And it's something, I don't know, is it something that you it's for clear it's since the beginning, but is it something that when you revise the editions, it's something that you look up to connect more, to come with more connections, or not necessarily?
Well, I think both.
Excuse me, Kristin, if I may say something, I'm a huge fan of your past film top, which you publish every year. The films from 80 years ago, and yes. I found a connection in what between what Andrei is asking and this marvelous try to bring back to life films from the past. And I also think that when you see the film, when you see an old film, it has the chance of being alive again.
Yeah, well, David and I have always been interested in the idea of norms and deviations. That is, the classical cinema has norms that have been circulated throughout the world, shot, reverse shot, and various structures, narrative structures, and so on. So films do influence later films, and norms that were created long ago are in some ways still being used, especially in Hollywood. I think we've tried to emphasize that, the idea of a post-Hollywood is not very viable, because so many norms from decades ago are still being used in Hollywood. But also filmmakers, good filmmakers, watch a lot of films, especially films from the past. I mean, somebody like Damien Chazelle has an immense knowledge of the past cinema, and he uses it in his films. And there's also the idea that nothing new comes entirely from nothing. There's always some precedent, because people's imaginations just aren't great enough to come up with something absolutely new. And you look at Wes Anderson's films, for example. He obviously has watched Tati's films. So it's sort of built into filmmaking that there is this influence and this connection between the past and the present. And I think there's one example we use where we compare Beetlejuice to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And there is a German expressionist element in Beetlejuice. So yeah, that is, I think, an important aspect of our work.
I would love to be able to play what you just said back to our publisher, though, as well, because McGraw-Hill hates those little call outs. Every year we have to, or every time we do a new edition, we have to fight for those page numbers and the references back to earlier sections of the text, because they just feel it clutters things up. I think it's maybe a sign of how committed they are to the ebook, that when you look at the ebook, every one of those little references back has an embedded link so that a student can just click on it and it takes them right back to the page and section that is being referenced. They kind of like that idea because it's very interactive, but just on the page, they're not a big fan of it. But this is the reason why we fight for it. We are always suggesting, no, it's important that students understand these kinds of connections between the past and later developments.
So I'm not sure I understood. So they don't like this idea because they think it complicates the reading of the book, or why do they oppose this connection?
I think they feel like those little references kind of get cluttered in the text, so it maybe interrupts the flow of reading. But
it's true, it interrupts it for a brief moment, but it's always, I don't know how to say, it's enriching. Always, because it makes, and I like it more on the page than on the what you described, to go to another page, because it makes it's not that you go back to that chapter for, I mean, I never did, but of course I translated it, so I knew at least, not perfectly, but I knew what it was referring to. But it's that brief moment in which your mind just reactivates all that information that you already got there, and you don't need to, I don't know, to defalcate it, to put everything on the table, because it's there. So it enriches very much the experience of reading, I think, and of not only of reading, of understanding, and of what I really love about this book. Another thing that I really love is that it even though it cannot go into detail with everything that brings on the table, that brings as kind of information, at least it gives hints of what you could, of how big it's all, of how history of film, it's something so big that you cannot put it in a book or in 2 books or in 3 books, but at least it gives you hints of many specters, of many fields that you can search on your own. I don't know if you want, but at least you realize that they exist, that problem exists, and it's something interesting to address for yourself, or I don't know, or for others. I mean, and these references for me work that way, in a way, you know, building up the complexity of approaching history in a way. It's
Yeah,
something
I think it's a way of making students more interested in past films. I mean, if they love a film, say Beetlejuice, and you say, well, the German Expressionist films were a big influence on this, they might become more interested in German Expressionist films. Obviously, a lot of students are reluctant to watch old films, especially silent films, black and white films. But I think the connections that we make with more modern films do intrigue them. At least some of them. The ones who are more inclined to be film buffs.
Mm-hmm. I also
Well,
had, sorry.
I was going to say, this is often the case that we will make back to McGraw-Hill, is that we are writing the book for students who are going to have different levels of interest, and you don't want to, you know, dumb down things, because there are going to be students will be really engaged with the material and will seek out more information or, you know, other films to watch. And so, you know, the assumption that maybe a lot of the kids in this class are just taking it for credit, and, you know, once it's over, it's over. Yeah, that may be true, but it's also, you want to be able to, you know, activate the imaginations of those students who really become interested, and give them what they need to help them pursue their own kind of areas of interest. And that's something that I think we feel is really important, and make that case to McGraw-Hill every time.
Okay, so we will not keep you longer. Only two brief questions. One is, I mean, I have this curiosity when you do this kind of project, very wide project with so many implications. Do you have the impulse to, I don't know, to exclude films that maybe you don't like so much, or you don't put the problem that way? Because I also have this kind of fights with the different films that I think they are overrated from the past, that are part of the canon. Is it something that you address to yourself, or it's not at all important when you, I don't know, when you give more space to something than to something else, or maybe exclude something completely, something that is considered to be by many very important, of course?
Well, I think occasionally, yes, we probably, given a choice of a number of films we might use as examples, we will probably use films that we admire more, that we enjoy more. But I guess we often resist that impulse, and I think there probably are films we don't like very much that are in the book.
I would say, just based on my, you know, experience talking with David over the years, like when he taught that course on post-war European film, he kind of acknowledged to the class that he was not a big fan of Ingmar Bergman. In fact, the one Bergman film he showed was Brink of Life, which he happened to like, but which is very much not part of the Bergman canon. And yet, when you look at the book, there is a very detailed and very excellent discussion of Bergman. So to me, that's strong evidence that if we recognize the importance of a filmmaker based on their reputation, and we feel that they merit inclusion, as Bergman does, for any discussion of, you know, 50s and 60s European art cinema, yes, you commit to writing that section on Bergman. But
that does sort of confirm what I was saying, that if you have a group of films, you might pick your favorite.
Yeah.
Is it something that you are particularly pleased or happy that you included and gave more space, and maybe helped that filmmaker or film gain more recognition in the book?
Yes, this is one rare example where we revised a very early chapter in a later edition, because a filmmaker came to be known much better than he had been before. And that's Albert Capellani, the French director for Pathé in the early period. He was more or less a contemporary of Feuillade, but he was known almost not at all by scholars today. He had been mentioned for his masterpieces, Germinal and Les Miserables, but in 2010, the Il Cinema Ritrovato Festival in Bologna showed a whole series of his restored films, and they were magnificent, starting 1906 and going up to 1913. And they had another retrospective the following year of films that had been restored in the meantime. And here suddenly appeared a filmmaker who was probably close to as good as Griffith, as good as Feuillade, and we had not known about him. So now there's a section in the book, it was added to the 4th edition. So you have it in your copy, your new translation. That doesn't happen very often, but it was sort of a little earthquake in the study of early cinema, and we certainly thought it needed to be included. Capellani gets fairly prominent attention in our book at this point.
Okay, so my last question is very not related necessarily to the content of the book, but I'm very intrigued by the dedication of the book. Chez Léon tout est bon. This is, I search on Google, this is like a hostel or a hotel, or it's a person? It's very poetic, or it's something from a poem?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that.
So I said I was very intrigued and attracted by the dedication from the first page of the book, Chez Léon tout est bon. Is this like a place or it's a person? Because I Googled it to maybe, I thought it's maybe a quote or something, but I found a place in Paris.
Yeah, it's sort of an in-joke.
Oh.
The book is dedicated to Gabrielle Claes, who was the curator of the Belgian Cinematheque that I mentioned. She was a great friend of ours, and we often went to a restaurant called Chez Léon and ate Belgian food. So that was it.
It's a very nice dedication. I like it.
Yeah, that was the motto of the restaurant, Chez Léon tout est bon.
Very nice.
Yeah.
It's a great way to start the book. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation to talk to us. I hope we didn't bore you too much with our questions.
No, not at all.
It was a big pleasure again to work on through the translation of this book and to meet you virtually. I will not lie to you. I would not start working immediately on a new translation of one of your books, but after 1 year of a break, I would love to do it again because it's so exciting. It's such a great process.
Yeah. Well, it's very good to hear that translations into Romanian are beginning to happen, and I do hope there will be future ones.